I want to thank you so much. There are some faces here I recognize, even though behind a mask. Friends of the family, particularly of my mother. And so I'm very grateful to have you all be here for what's really the inaugural presentation of the novel. So if you'll forgive me, because my memory often forgets little points, I want to read a few things about Lorna de Sosa, and then we'll go ahead and I'll describe a little bit what the novel's about. And depending on time and interest, I will read you a few excerpts to give you a flavor of the book. So, Lorna was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and moved to Berkeley, California in 1964, where she became a resident until she died at the age of 96. Her paternal grandparents, and this is why Elvira, one of the reasons I'm doing this presentation here today, there is a Hungarian connection here, and I'm about to tell you. Her paternal grandparents emigrated from their native Debrecen in Hungary in 1875, settling in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her grandfather in his youth had been a participant in a craze very popular among some of the daring young men known as steeplechasing. Everybody hear of that? Well, this was a craze where young men on a dare would climb a cathedral steeple, and if they were even crazier than that, they would attempt to stand on their heads at the top. Yeah. My great-grandfather survived, thank goodness, otherwise I wouldn't be here to tell you about this nutty story. But he also was a gifted engineer and founded what eventually became the largest bronze architectural manufacturing plant in the United States, and also in Cincinnati. Among the many projects was the manufacturing and installation of bronze doors, windows, and stairs and railings seen in many churches, public buildings, and particularly one of the most famous one is they designed and installed the Louisiana State House that stands to this day, a national landmark. They also did the installation for the National Historic Trust Deco designed Sherry Netherlands Hotel, a architectural gem in Cincinnati. But when aluminum overcame the industry and bronze, and particularly the craftsmen, most of them came from the old country, and they began to die out, and of course aluminum became the new thing. Remember aluminum siding? They then switched part of their production to that, and they actually contributed the doors, railings, and the windows of the SS United States, which was launched in 1952, and incredibly still holds today for the fastest transatlantic speed record for liner, outrunning even warships, battleships. Unfortunately, it is in wet anchorage outside of Philadelphia. There's a foundation that started to try to restore it, and who knows, but it's one of those wonders of American technology. He was also an inventor, and among some of the things I found that he had done were a liquid hair color restorer, which you might appreciate, an automatic liquid vending apparatus, and I even have a patent number of 711069 of October 14, 1902, a clockwork-like device for automatically turning on and off gas street lamps before electricity was available, a man's belt buckle with a concealed spring he named Expando, and believe me, I wish I could find one of those. He also did various animated window displays, and this one I love. He had a life-size figure of a lady seated in a chair, this is a Victorian lady, who decorously raised her long dress to expose her beautiful footwear. And not the least, he came up with what later became known as the automat, better known as the Horn and Hardart, which he sold to somebody who sold it to Horn and Hardart. He sold it for $45. Our family is good at not making money, but inventing things. And he did other things, bronze movie theater ticket booths, a brass bed, and he somehow found the time to father 8 children. So that's on her paternal side. On her maternal side, I'll be much more brief. They immigrated from what was then part of Russia and later Poland, in the constant to and fro between the shifting alliances and conquest. So her grandfather sailed with his wife and 7 children via Montreal from Hamburg in 1891. He eventually settled in Dayton, Ohio, and for the rest of his life had a prosperous and well-known practice as an optician, although he was university trained and has practiced as an ophthalmologist. I'd like to get to the bottom of why he didn't continue there, but maybe it was a language thing, who knows. My mother's mother, whom unfortunately I never met, died after an operation for her gallbladder at the age of 45. One of her brothers studied at Cambridge University in England, was an economic professor at Stanford, go Bears, and was part of President Franklin Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet, helping devise the administration's farm policy. His papers are held today at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, I believe. An aunt of hers was also renowned for her fashion. She had one of the most fashionable boutique, haute couture, Dior, all those things in Dayton, Ohio. And I remember years later, I was working in the Senate. I came across a congressman from Dayton. I said, "Oh, do you happen to know this person?" I'm thinking, no. He says, "Of course, Lee's shop, it was famous. Everybody who wanted to get beautiful things for special occasion went to her shop." So you can see my family's anchored in the Midwest in some regards. At any rate, what about Lorna? She was the only child with many cousins and aunts and uncles on both sides living close by. She was the firstborn of the numerous cousins, and there's no doubt that from an early age, she was much doted over by her parents. One could even say indulged. And those of you who know Lorna know what I'm talking about. But along with that, drama became her passion, and so did French and Spanish. But she also grew up hearing her parents and grandparents speaking Hungarian, Russian, German, French, and Italian. My father, when he first was introduced to the family as a college student, told me that he walked in and the conversation was in English and all of a sudden shifted to Hungarian, then Russian, then German, then French. He only knew little broken English and Spanish, so he had a hard time, but they always had a very good time, apparently. At any rate, as soon as she learned what the alphabet meant, Lorna never stopped writing. She was the editor of the school paper and had several poems published in the local newspaper while she was even in elementary school. At the age of 6 or 7, she also began to give dramatic performances and created extemporaneous plays for the children in her neighborhood in her parents' backyard. I have a photograph of Lorna organizing plays with these kids. She explored both callings of writing and drama as she grew up with equal fervor and passion, which would continue to develop during her later years of schooling. During these years, she was very much involved with drama and would go on to win the Midwest Shakespearean contest of acting. Though Lorna wanted to attend one of the Northeastern Big Sister colleges, my rather prudish Victorian grandfather thought that was a little too risky for a young, virtuous woman and decided she'd be safer attending Tulane University, the college for women, which was called Sophie Newcomb in New Orleans. That was a bad decision because that's where she met my playboy father. Now, he was part of a tradition of Cuban parents to send their sons to universities in the United States, particularly Tulane, but also in Europe. The reason being that to have them go to study at the University of Havana was asking for trouble. It was a hotbed of revolution, armed insurrection, and gang warfare, literally deadly gang warfare, of which later Fidel Castro was a member of one of these gangs. At any rate, so to dissuade her from this continuing relationship with this Latino, he brought her back to Cincinnati and she started attending the University of Cincinnati. Well, my father wasn't going to have any of that, and he transferred to the University of Cincinnati as well. So what happened? Eventually she did graduate work at Columbia University, Cincinnati College of Music and Dramatic Arts, and during those years she was also directing, writing, and producing radio documentaries at WKRC Cincinnati and acting at national radio programs on WLW. She went on to New England and New York in stock companies where she developed as an actress, trained in the English tradition by John Redhead Fromm, and was founder and director of the Cincinnati Civic Theater. So let's get to the story here. How did she come by Havana? Well, I think you have a hint already. After a very dramatic and very romantic elopement during one of the worst winter storms in Chicago in 1931, my father showed up and proposed to her right there and then. They eloped, but had the good sense of going back to Cincinnati and completing their wedding at a Catholic church whose name eludes me right now. However, my father chose to follow a career in medicine, and when he was offered an internship at the University of San Francisco or at the University of Havana, he chose Havana primarily because his mother, who was widowed, was living there alone, and he felt that that was his duty as a dutiful son to go back to Cuba. So they went to Cuba just before the U.S. entered the Second World War in 1940. And let me quote her first impressions of arriving in Havana. From the moment the SS Florida docks at the port of Havana and I descended, hearing and seeing the pulse and colors of the smell of Cuba, it was for me love at first sight. Strangely enough, it also seemed to be home for me. Sooner than I expected, this feeling led me into a meeting with Rubia Barcia, a brilliant drama professor who had fled from the Spanish Civil War, and together, as founders and directors, his project to found a drama academy in Havana became the Academia de Artes Dramáticas, or the Academy of Dramatic Arts. With the enthusiastic collaboration of the Cuban intellectuals, well, I don't expect you'll know these, but for the sake, like Jorge Mañach, Suarez Solis, Luis Amado Blanco, and Luis Baralt, and artists like you may recognize Wilfredo Lam and René Portocarrero, who are two of the best-known Cuban mid-century plastic artists today. And musicians like Maestro Felix Guerrero. The project became a reality. From this emerged another project which was called the Patronato del Teatro, or the Patrons of Theater, and another group, Teatrala, which was a commercial production company producing and directing native and international dramatists from Chekhov to Sartre, from Mon to Lope de Vega. Under a cultural fellowship from the Spanish government in Madrid, she met and obtained exclusive rights to produce works in the Americas from leading dramatist Antonio Buero Vallejo, one of Spain's leading and one of his most brilliant dramatists of the last century. She also studied in Paris with Louis Jouvet at the Comédie Française in the 1950s. And under her tutelage, actors from Latin America and Cuba started prominent careers. She pioneered new forms of dramatic interpretation, largely unknown in Havana at that time, and also produced and directed the first dramatic TV and radio programs in Cuba. Her last production was the Italian farce Filomena Marturano of Neapolitan author Eduardo de Filippo, which was later brought to the screen by Vittorio De Sica with Sophia Loren in the principal role in a movie that was later changed to Divorce Italian Style. It's a real farce if you've ever seen it. She was appointed by the Cuban government to produce and direct national dramatic festivals, including the Canción Cubana, with an original score composed specifically by Rubén Romeo and orchestrated by Maestro Guerrero, and played by the Havana Philharmonic. She said she felt the greatest honor was being the Order of José Martí, who's the George Washington of Cuba, the patriot of their liberation from Spain, for her cultural contributions. She also represented Cuba in Latin American festivals and theater institutes and in Paris. One of the many plays she directed was Desire Under the Elms by Eugene O'Neill, as well as Life is a Dream by Golden Age Spanish dramatist Calderón de la Barca, which was critically acclaimed as outstanding productions, revealing developing talents. You might see their faces come up, well, these are part from the plays, of Alejandro Lugo and Violeta Casal, who later were lionized by the Cuban Revolution as products of their ideology. Well, it actually started 20 years earlier than that. And here's an interesting anecdote that kind of reminds me a little bit of my grandfather from Hungary, the inventor. During the Second World War, they had a production of Life is a Dream by Calderón. But since there was a lack of resources, she came up for a technique of rapid scene changes by employing two military trucks. So while one pulled one scene in, the other truck pulled the other one so that there would be a seamless transition between scenes within the play. In a time when TV or television had not yet arrived, Lorna was radio director at CMQ Cadena Azul, or the Blue Channel, the most listened radio in the country. Nightly, she would host mystery programs. Years later, before leaving Cuba, she won an award for TV dramas. At any rate, so what happened? In 1955, my mother had divorced 3 years previous, and we moved to Manhattan, my sister and myself, where we began our schooling, and I learned English. English is my second language. She also began to undertake the writing of the novel. Eventually, she moved to California, as I said, in 1960, and finally Berkeley in 1964. She relished the energy of the Bay Area, city lights, most bookstores, and not to mention all the great delicatessens and eateries here, and the vibrant cultural life that the campus played. She taught applied theology right up here at the Graduate Theological Union, just behind us, was director in late training at St. Albert's Priory, and drama at San Francisco State University. While she always wrote since childhood, she didn't get around to publishing until her 90th birthday, when 2 books of poetry finally came out, and now Infinite Corner, the novel that languished for years. Now, Infinite Corners was begun in Cuba in the late 40s, and the first draft was finished 10 years later when she moved to Manhattan. Poet John Chardy at the Breadloaf Writers Conference in Middlebury, Vermont, praised it highly as a work in progress. Later, Paul Engel, the founder of the Iowa School of Writing, was so impressed by it that he sent letters to his celebrated former students saying that the novel deserved their attention. In the late 50s, the editor of a major publishing house in New York was so interested in the unfinished novel that he would send a messenger every few days to pick up the latest few pages she'd written. However, considering the sensitive relations between Cuba and the United States at that time, we're talking the 60s, remember the missile crisis, the publisher also wanted to omit passages in the novel that were critical of the US government policy toward Cuba. This Lorna refused to do, and as a result, the novel went unpublished until this last year. As her last and final editor, Anita Grossman.
Susan.
Anita, she always gets me on this one. But I call her Sue Grossman. You're going to have to go with that one.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Sue. And I want to quote something she put in the introduction to the book that better encapsulates what it's about rather than me. And Sue points out that in her remarks for the book, Infinite Corner portrays a cross-section of Cuban society through a multi-layered narrative. This is an authentic representation of Havana life in the 1940s, a warning of the upheaval to come well before the revolution that was to engulf the country for over half a century and still counting. We're introduced to a world whose landmarks have a deep symbolic resonance. Most notably, the ruined Camacho estate suggests the fate of Cuba itself, seemingly doomed to alternating cycles of revolution and corruption. The mansion was built in a unique individual style, flagrantly romantic, replete with carved wooden gargoyles. Much of the novel concerns the struggle of what is to become of the estate, which overlaps with the question of Cuba's future as a nation. In both cases, we encounter idealists who struggle to maintain their integrity, dreamers who are trying to escape the trap life sets for them and their country. The characters are vividly realized in the depiction of their curiously evolving relationships. The language throughout is unique in its perspective and helps convey the flavor of idiomatic Cuban speech to the English speaker. The scenes are carefully orchestrated with each character, no matter how minor, distinctively imagined. As in a play, we're aware of each character's entry and unique voice. Lorna said that several things inspired the novel, and she wrote, "I had heard my mother-in-law speak of her youth in the Canary Islands, and of her father, who was tall, white-haired, and very, very blue-eyed, an agriculturalist who was slowly retiring from life to live up toward the peak of the Teide Mountain, which is an extinct volcano, which was snow-peaked year-round. It was called El Pico del Teide, or the Mansion of the Evil One. Simply, the vision of him had intrigued me. Why was he wishing to leave his family and his life? I still don't know. I was intrigued by a beautiful old mansion on an obscure point in the Vedado suburb of Havana, which was built very close to the water. I would go there frequently to be by myself and noticed that there were several people who evidently occupied the garden grounds. I wondered about the owners who had abandoned the mansion and how in the world they could have left something as beautiful as this. As I was looking up at one of its towers one afternoon and wondering what kind of a story would come to my imagination, one of the wooden gargoyles that seemed an integral part of the wooded tower fell directly at my feet. I picked it up, asked, and this is very typical, asked what it was saying to me, and knew I was to write a story about this house and this gargoyle. For many years she kept that gargoyle as a memento which adorns the chapter headings of the novel. The novel is a little more than autobiographical in other ways. Quoting her again, "First, I would wish to create people who lived in that garden and why they were there, who had owned it, left it, and why. Why had they been involved? What had they been involved in during their lives there? I reflected on the estate's probable historical period. I thought of the Dance of the Millions, and then perhaps earlier, near the post-revolution of independence from Spain in 1898. And I took it from there. The first character you will meet in the garden that I'll read you a little bit of is called Arsenio. It occurred to me he was a composite of the great Cuban artist Ponce, Fidelio Ponce. I never saw his paintings. They were worth many thousands of dollars, but he was always in debt. He paid prostitutes by leaving one of his paintings with them. Not unlike some of the Impressionists, as I recall, if you ever went to, what's it called, the Auberge du Soleil in Vannes or something like that, where you see these Picassos and all kinds of, it's a museum, and apparently they paid their way by donating these paintings. Anyway, so as she quotes, many brothels in Havana contain these precious paintings. He often dropped in to visit me in Miramar because he was intrigued by my face and wanted to paint me. His sketches of me were interrupted by his death at an early age, yet he saw me in two ways, one as a feminine Renoir and the other as a very strong Toulouse-Lautrec character, even to having an eagle either perched on my head or on my hand. So I hope that's a little bit of an introduction to set the tone for the book. Now let's see how we're doing time-wise. Would you like to hear maybe a few more minutes of some excerpts from the novel? Okay. It's very hard in trying to choose the selections because she didn't mean this just as an action, adventure, or historical novel. She really wanted to create a narrative story that was literary because her style was very poetic. And it's very hard to encapsulate from one page her whole style. In a way, this novel really is a draft for somebody doing a script for a movie. I think it would make a wonderful movie because her sense of theater and drama and timing are really integral to her book. And you will see that, I hope, if and when you read the novel. So let me begin with chapter 1, which is a little slow, but it sets the tone. And then I will talk a little bit about what the novel is really about. So chapter 1. The sun shone brightly on the tin can full of cigarette butts, and its harsh gleam was an alarm clock to Arsenio's trained eyelids. He blinked them slowly, pushed the can out of the sun, and looked up at the morning sky. No cloud yet. So he could lie there for a while, watching the little worms and globes that skidded across the pale ceiling. They always floated by in the same direction, and he would follow them with the tail end of his eyes. Sometimes they would float right through the tree branches like ectoplasmic worms. He arose, stretching and scratching and rubbing if there happened to be an antline marching over him, ambled slowly over to the broken wall facing the sea, and urinated. He liked to watch the ocean as he did so. The sea's soft, familiar voice, its clean breath, carajo, which is a very Cuban expression. How much better than coming to life each morning at the side of a woman. Sometimes he would remember his wife, the smell of her all over the place, the sound of her quick movements, filling the small room where they had lived on the other side of the city in the crowded old Havana. A woman was much to have all day in your room. He grinned, showing a few yellow teeth, and thought how fortunate he was now. On the other hand, Chanley Po, who lived near him under the wild grape tree, wasn't so lucky. Every morning when Arsenio was still snoring, he was up and gone, hurrying to some mysterious transaction in Havana that produced a big can of cooked rice, sometimes with bread, even black beans or fried banana. Once he'd come back with a chunk of pork so big that everyone in the garden had eaten some. Well, that was fine, but it wasn't worth mixing with people early in the morning. People were something that you had to work up to gradually to bear. So that's just a little piece I wanted to review that. Now the novel develops essentially, there are three protagonists. There's Jorge, who is a young architect, very idealistic, and he's sort of a ne'er-do-well because of his idealism. He will not allow himself to be bought out by shady developers into doing less than excellent work. He's just one of those kind of guys. Then you have Lourdes. Lourdes is the love interest of Jorge in the novel, and she's a Cuban beauty who's married to the son of a very wealthy developer. This gentleman's name is Mario, and they started out in their youth with very high ideals about what was to become of Cuba and what they were going to do for Cuba and its independence. And over time, Mario is sucked in by his father's enterprise and succumbs and becomes like all the other elite in Cuba, particularly Havana, where corruption is rife, where politicians can be bought, and where the Americans have a very large interest in the state of the economy of the country. So you have these three characters. Lourdes becomes disappointed in her marriage to Mario, and by coincidence one day she meets Jorge. Now Jorge is depicted here as an architect, but the real life character he was partially taken from Maestro Felix Guerrero, who was a friend of hers. And he was equally idealistic. And so this love affair develops between them. Of course, she knows that her husband Mario, following the Cuban tradition of having affairs immediately regardless of the marriage, it was just an accepted norm in Cuba at that time, as it was in much of Latin America and even in parts of Italy and the Mediterranean world. So they begin this affair. The husband never knows about it, and that progresses. Now, the other side of the story is this abandoned mansion that was built, as they said, in the Dance of the Millions. What was that? During the First World War, Cuba was a great sugar producer, and when the prices of sugar were sky high, many Cubans made millions from this, and that's why it was called the Dance of the Millions. But when the war ended, all of a sudden the prices of sugar fell, and there was a Great Depression, and a lot of people went bankrupt. So the question is, was this part of that story? So the story of the mansion has to do with a crazy old woman who's from the Canary Islands, partially taken based on my grandmother, who was from the Canaries. Not that she was crazy, but from the Canary Islands. And a love affair she had with a man who had built this mansion, who was a patriot. And he disappeared one time and said, "You will keep this house for us to the day I return to a Cuba that we can make free again," or something to that effect. Well, of course, he never returns, but the descendants of this man eventually decide they want to sell the property to Mario's father, who's the developer. So that's where Jorge comes in, and I don't want to do a spoiler because I like you to get the book, right? But you can see where this is going. But underlying this, there are always these parallels between what the mansion represents, Cuba, through the vicissitudes of its history and time, and what happens to it in the future of it, and how an idealist wants to do something for the middle class and the poor people of Cuba in that development, and how his plans are foiled by these corrupt people and so forth. So there are elements of that in the novel. There are elements of Cuban politics at the time. So this gives you also, and I say this, you don't find this in most of the books, and particularly novels written about Cuba. I haven't come across one yet that deals with this period. It's actually said, as Sue pointed out to me, and I never realized the exact date, 1947. So this is already 12 years before Castro took over in the revolution of 1959. And he appears in a little cameo appearance in the book as a university student, following in the footsteps of one of the great political heroes of the time, of the liberal students, who later, in a fit of depression, shot himself during one of his radio programs over his frustration of the corruption of Cuban society. His name was Eduardo Chivas. So anyway, I've given you a lot of, you can see this book, as I know Sue agrees, and the publisher really wanted her to make 3 books out of it. And her original story actually was going to begin in the Canary Islands with this great-grandfather, but unfortunately she never got around to that. So let me skip ahead and read to you a little bit of chapter 3. This is when Jorge is looking for a bodega near where the room that he rents to meet Lourdes for their assignations, if I may use that term. And he needs to make a phone call to set up an appointment to use this room. So he comes to this, and I'll read where it starts. He thought he remembered noticing the Bodega La Victoria somewhere in this section. There it was, just right, far enough from their new apartment to merit no patronage from his mother or sister, yet near enough for him to receive a message from Lourdes. There was sure to be a phone. He pulled to the curb and decided he would wait in the car for a while to give Oscar a little more time. That's the guy who had the room. The bodega's lively rhythm splashed out on the hot street. There was always the noise of people buying groceries, dice players having a drink at the bar, and Francisco, the Spanish proprietor, generally enjoying himself, whether it was talking or singing or attending to customers. The way he shoveled into the shiny mounds of garbanzos, rice, black beans, red beans, or judías that gleamed from their partition glass counter made you think that he liked being a bodeguero. The morning had been a busy one, and now, as usual, right after lunch, 2 drivers of the corner taxi stand were playing patas while waiting to pick up their afternoon regulars. Why sit around in the taxi waiting for other calls when they knew that most of the Vedado ladies were just dressing now after the siesta and would not be going out until late afternoon? So why not enjoy yourself? Also, Mateo, the neighborhood policeman, would surely be around with a good story to pay for his beer. He never missed. La vida es un fandango, Francisco was singing as he packed a customer's grocery order. These new lyrics caused one of the drivers, called Pancho, to look up from the game and nudge his companion, Isidro. They were familiar with Francisco's habit of improvising songs from old Spanish proverbs. Never heard that one before, he called to Francisco. Y quien no lo baile es un tonto. Francisco lustily sang out. I like that one, Pancho approved. Life is a fandango, and who doesn't dance it is a fool. You know, sometimes these Spaniards make sense. Eh, Isidro? But not often, Isidro laughed. Undisturbed, Francisco continued his song. An admirably shining pate was more in evidence than the meticulously plastered strands which he thought concealed it. And a flourishing pump-handle mustache sprang from a face which was as rosy as when he had left his native Galicia 20 years before. Havana indolence had neither diminished his earthy vitality nor softened the crisp Spanish accent. His entire person attested to the inviolability of the Gallego, son of northern Spain, land of St. James the Apostle. Well, well, good morning, he welcomed as Marquesa entered. Now let me interject. Marquesa is a crazy lady from the abandoned house. He treated her with a deference one might have expected for only the best customers. You must be doing some extra cleaning, he said, referring to the empty pail she carried. Yes, indeed, Don Francisco, she answered. You see, I have a feeling that something is going to happen soon. Her eyes lightened with a lovely secret, and I must have the house ready for it. This remark caused Pancho and Isidro to suspend the dice throwing. A feeling what's going to happen, Isidro asked warily. They all had heard rumors about the house, and if they were true, poor Marquesa. Ah, she smiled waggishly. I know, you mean he's coming. Satisfied that she suspected nothing, Isidro reverted to his customary banter with her. But he was not disrespectful. Even though no one knew who she was, except a little crazy, she was a real lady. That was why they called her Marquesa, or Marquise. Francisco took the pail from her, and she protested. It is my pleasure, he said. After all, we're both from the mother country, aren't we? He filled it and would have offered to carry it part of the way, but he knew from long experience that she would refuse. Canary Islanders were as proud and strong as those from his own province of Galicia. Have a nice day, he said. And God guard you too, she answered. The weight of the water pail did not alter the straight, tall way she walked as she left the bodega. La vida es un fandango, Francisco began to sing again as he returned to his work. If your calf is bleeding to bring me luck, do not bother, Isidro called as he shook the dice in the leather cubilete. He tossed them out and they rolled over the counter. Ha! No runs, no hits, I got 4 kings. We'll see what we do about that, Pancho shouted. He scooped up the 4 dice and they rattled and shivered through the bodega. He tossed them out. 3 fairies left, Isidro. See where they'll get you. From the radio, the Servando Diaz trio was playing a guaracha. The maracas and guitar cut the grocery air as clean and precise as the dice. There's nothing philosophic about Sophia's hips, the trio sang. Candita's slippers clapped over the floor as she entered. She lived in one of the crowded solares nearby. I've eaten lunch 3 times today, she announced to anyone in the bodega, and I'm still wondering what I want for breakfast. I've got tapeworm. She held out a kitchen cup to Francisco to fill with a dime's worth of black beans. Nothing can ever satisfy me, she complained in a voice like a tired steam whistle. Christ, I wouldn't like to be in your man's shoes, remarked Pancho's cousin Hilario, who had been seated at a table going through Bohemia magazine. Does that tapeworm get in on everything, sniggered Pancho. For what you're thinking of, I was the same before I got the tapeworm, Candita retorted. She tugged at her 2 pigtails that lanced out behind her taut face. The dice rattled over the counter. Try to beat that, 4 crowns in 1, shouted Pancho. The other scooped up the dice. Candita, you read in the paper about the invention of the mechanical heart, Pancho's cousin Hilario called. No kidding, so help me. That's right, Pancho said. You'll now be able to walk around with a spare heart in your pocket. Americanos make it? Who else? If they can make mechanical hearts, they can make a mechanical anything else, remarked Pancho. And for Candita's husband, I wasn't thinking about the mechanical heart. Here's your beans, Francisco took her a dime. She turned her face towards the players at the counter. About needing spare parts, Pancho, don't judge everyone from yourself. As her slippers clapped out the door, Isidro cawed at Pancho's expense. The dice were clattering again with the smell of sawdust and steaming coffee rising towards them. Jorge entered the bodega and looked around for a public telephone. Change for a dime, please, he said to Francisco. So that's that chapter. Thank you. So, I could read you a little bit more, but I think I've abused you. I had a little political part about U.S.-Cuban relations, but you can read it in the book. So I promised Elena and Elvira and also Eva that I would allow some time for any comments, questions, observations, critiques, suggestions. So.
I'm just curious, it must have been written in Spanish, was it?
No, it was written in English, and that's what I find so special about it, how she's able to translate that Cuban humor, that kind of black humor that is so Cuban in Spanish in many ways, into an American English idiom, hopefully. Yeah. Let's start in the front and then work my way back.
Did you grow up with the book being written?
Oh God, yes.
What did she say?
She was a plant in the audience. My wife put her up to this. That's my wife, Maureen, back there with the sunglasses on her head. My mother was, I think from the old days, I mean, as we were kids growing up in Cuba, we lived in Miramar, which is a very nice neighborhood, still is to this day. My house is still there. Supposedly, it's still mine, but good luck with that one. But I remember, they'd have, when my parents were still married, they would have parties late into the night, and, painters and artists and actors and actresses, and, and they would be playing the piano and singing. It was kind of like a little bit like a F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of thing, but a Cuban bohemian way of life. And my sister and I would sneak down the stairs and peer over, and once in a while we'd be caught and sent upstairs. So this is all by way of saying that my mother was a nocturnal animal. And I don't think she ever went to sleep before 2 or 3. Some of her friends probably know that, and probably also got calls at 2 or 3 in the morning. Yeah. So when we moved to New York and we were living in Manhattan, she would sleep usually till around 11. And of course I had to get to school. I was going to Loyola at that time in Manhattan, and I'd have to get up, make my breakfast, and get out. And if I so much as made any abrupt noise that would wake her up, it would be hell to pay the rest of the day because she was half asleep. So yes, I learned very early on, as Maureen will tell you, to open and close doors like a ninja, to get dressed that you never hear a shoe drop, and to quietly leave a space because I didn't want to disturb her. So yeah, that was part of my growing up. Thanks for that question. I'm sorry, there was a question here. Yeah.
Yeah. What was your parents' role in Cuba? What were they?
Well, as I try to give you a little bit of a picture, she went there, and it was a very interesting period because during the Second World War, and the Hungarian angle, by the way, Jan Starker, the famous cellist, went to Cuba with his wife and his daughter, Gabriela, and lived in Havana for a while. They couldn't get into the United States. They were Jewish. He left Hungary. And it was very hard during the war to get into Cuba, as you know, from the famous incident of that boat that was turned back, I forget, New York Harbor, and sent back to Germany, where most of them were sent to concentration camps. But anyway, there was a big influx of intelligentsia that came to Latin America and Cuba in particular. And it injected a new vibrancy into already what was a very interesting intellectual artistic life in Cuba. So that coincided. It was a fabulous time in Cuba. And a lot of the artists you hear about Cuba, the famous Alicia Alonso, the ballet dancer, they were all part of that generation that grew up in that milieu. okay? And people like Wilfredo Lam, the famous artist, also was part of that group. He designed some stage sets for her plays and things like that. So she happened to come into that as a gringa who spoke fluent Spanish but with a heavy American accent. But she would crack the whip. She would go in for a rehearsal. These people would stroll in 10, 15, 30, an hour late, and she would look at him and says, "That's not happening again." And so, but she said that she could get out of Cuban actors in 2-hour rehearsals when it would take her 2 weeks to get out of an American actor. They're just natural born actors, okay? My father decided to go to medical school. He studied at the University of Havana. He was an OBGYN. And eventually, because medicine was pretty socialized then, the Cuban Constitution of 1940 to this day is one of the most advanced constitutions in the Western Hemisphere. It makes the Biden agenda look pretty tame. I mean, there was free medicine, health, all kinds of things. Well, of course, that was buried by the dictators that came, and under the new regime, well, we know that story. So anyway, he practiced medicine for a few years, and then while he was a student, he was studying, and to sort of earn his keep, because he didn't come from wealthy parents, and he was an only child, and at that point his mother was a widow. He was a pharmaceutical salesman, and he knew the whole island. Eventually, he decided that was what he really wanted to do, and he ended up working for Pfizer. Thank you, Moderna. Pfizer shots. He was their CEO for the Caribbean and Central America. And when the revolution came, he was part of the people that were helping the revolutionaries fight the Batista regime. Because of the network of pharmacies across the island, he would send shipments of drugs, and concealed were bullets and things like that. Well, as many people know, the Cuban Revolution was not a communist revolution. And many people supported it, thinking, well, we're going to go back to the Constitution of 1940 and get back on this liberal agenda. Well, of course, that was thwarted. My father was jailed because in his office, when he ran Pfizer, their headquarters were in Havana, some communists tried to organize a union, but under the communists. And my father pretty much kicked them out. So paybacks are hell. When the revolution succeeds, these people now had power. And the first thing they said was that he was a counter-revolutionary. He was a pro-Batista, totally untrue. And next thing, he was jailed for a few days. Now, he happened to have known and helped one of the other great heroes of the revolution, a fellow by the name of Camilo Cienfuegos, who was the only rival to Castro for power. And to this day, there is the mystery and the suspicion that he was done in by, if not Fidel, his brother, or Che Guevara. He mysteriously disappeared in an airplane that crashed, flying from one side of Cuba to another, just at the time of the turning point when the revolution started going to the left, to the extreme left. But at any rate, Camilo was still alive then. He got my father out of jail. And prophetically, and this is before people read the handwriting on the wall, he said, "Salvador, this is not the revolution we fought for. This is going the way of communism. Raul and Che are getting the upper hand. If I were you, I'd get out and I wouldn't wait." And he did. So at that point, he had remarried. His second wife was from El Salvador. And she came from a very well-to-do family in El Salvador. And so he relocated to Central America, to El Salvador, where he eventually built the first genetic drug manufacturing plant in Central America under, his name. So, and it goes on and on. I won't bore you with the rest, but he was a very restless man. He opened a bank in Miami later. I mean, he did all kinds of stuff. And I have a half-brother from that marriage who lives in Miami. And so I have that part of the family. My sister, on the other hand, passed away exactly a year ago in October. She was 2 years older than myself and lived in Washington. So it's just my brother, half-brother, but I consider my real brother, and myself. So That's the
So
story.
did you always live in Cuba? Were you born in
No.
Cuba?
I was born in Cuba, but I had American citizenship from birth. My mother didn't think of registering me until I was like 7 years old, and we were visiting her parents in Cincinnati and went to get a passport at the U.S. Embassy, and they said, well, he's not even registered here. So I was registered as the child of an American citizen born abroad. So I have dual citizenship, and through my father, because his parents were Spanish, he also had Spanish citizenship, I could claim Spanish citizenship as well. So,
Who was it that was from the Canary Islands?
say that
You
again?
mentioned the Canary Islands?
Yes, well, on my father's side, they go back to the early conquest, unpopular term these days, when the Spaniards conquered the Canary Islands on their quest for a route to the spices of Asia and so forth. So in the late 14th, early 15th century, my ancestors went to the Canary Islands. One of them was a military, what they called a captain general, and he married the daughter, a princess, as the story goes, of one of the caciques or chieftains of one of the islands. And so that's on the Sosa side. On the Bonilla side, they come from the island of Lanzarote, which is an active volcano island. And when my wife and I were there back in 1997, I went to the capital of Lanzarote, Teguise, where the Bonilla side comes from. And I ran into a fellow on the street one day, and he turned out to be the secretary of the municipal government. And he turned out to be an amateur genealogist. And I mentioned the name, and he took me to his home. They're very friendly people. And he looked in his archives and brought out a letter that was dated 1860-something, I forget now. And it was a report to the governor of the island that he had returned from a business trip to Havana. The name was Bonilla, but I didn't recognize it. And I faxed it to my sister, and I said, I was looking for my grandfather because he died young. And she says, no, silly, that's our great-great-grandfather. So I thought, wow. Now the story was the Canaries were always subject to takeover by feuding powers, the English, the Portuguese, the Dutch, primarily. And so every once in a while there'd be like an eruption, particularly in Lanzarote, and the people would flee to one of the other 7 islands. Well, this was dangerous because on a number of occasions the rival powers came back before the inhabitants returned. So the king passed a law under penalty of death that you could not abandon the island without the permission of the governor, written permission. And that's what that letter was. I didn't have the letter granting him permission to leave, but I had the one where he's reporting that he's returned and had it notarized that he'd returned to the Canaries after his successful trip. So my grandmother was from the second marriage. Her mother was widowed, and she had half-sisters from the first marriage who married and moved to Havana. And my grandmother eventually moved to Cuba to be with her half-sisters, and that's how she ended up there. And she stayed there till she died at the age of 87 in 1974, for which the Cuban government would not give me a permit to go, even though I got the State Department to allow me to go, which was a rare thing for them to do because of my Cuban background. But the Cuban government, in their usual nice humanitarian attitude towards anybody who's not there, did not grant my request, so I was not able to console my grandmother when she passed away. But she's buried in the Colón Cemetery in Havana, which is the oldest cemetery in Cuba. It's one of the oldest. It's a fabulous one. If you've been to New Orleans and you've been to some of the old cemeteries where the tombs are above the ground, they're like sarcophagi. And what they have, the tradition is they can bury maybe 3-4 people, one on top of the other. And after a few years, they pull them up, and the oldest one, they collect the bones and they put it in an ossuary next to, and so they can keep recycling it. So it's very, ecological, if you want to put it that way.
So how was the Hungarian culture preserved with the oppression of the Cuban government? Closing
Well,
the churches,
I can't really speak to that personally. I wasn't aware of it at the time when I was on missions from the State Department. That's the only way I would go there. I went to Cuba on diplomatic missions the first time in 1977. And I remember speaking at a reception that the government held for the delegations. This was an international conference of the United Nations, in which Castro and all the high muckety-mucks were there. But I met the apostolic nuncio, and I said, tell me about the religious situation in Cuba. And he said, the Catholic Church is, we receive nothing but hostility from the government. They seem to want to push for the native Santeria African religion to compete with Catholicism and other Christians. And he said, some evangelical sects are making headway in Cuba. The government doesn't seem to oppress them like they do the Catholic Church. And I was quite surprised. That was that incident which went on in my record, because then I got into a debate with Fidel Castro, which I won't go into now, which almost got me, lynched by a mob of crazed Castroites. But anyway, we won't go into that. But anyway, during that interview, the apostolic minister told me, he says, no, the church is in very bad shape. Now, since that time, you may have noticed that the regime has tried to ameliorate that problem. But at the beginning of the revolution, including the priest who had been a Jesuit priest, the best school in Cuba was Belén in Havana, where all the best students went, where Castro went there as a scholarship student because his father didn't really have much money. And his teacher, who was also the priest who was my father's teacher, who came from Galicia, Father Jose Rurinos, was, along with all the foreign priests, thrown out of Cuba. They were jailed, and then they were kicked out, and he suffered greatly for that, and he died later in, I think in Panama, and was buried back in Galicia. But yeah, they didn't treat the Catholics well, and I assume with the Hungarians it would have been the same, but I'm sorry, I don't know that specific angle. There was another question here? Somebody? Oh, sorry.
A couple of questions on the book. I read it with great interest because a revolution is interesting, how society develops. And something similar happened actually in Hungary during World War I. First, it was a middle class type of revolution, and then the communists took over. That ended with World War I, but the second time communism happened to Hungary, they simply stayed because the Russian army, the Soviet army stayed in the country, so they supported the communist movement. That wasn't it. So I read it with interest. What I missed at the end, of course, is some sort of epilogue, how this nice middle class modernizing ideas, revolutionary ideas, then became a communist regime later.
Yeah, well, and I think in the book it gives you a little bit of a hint, because she wasn't writing a political novel either. She wanted to give you a flavor of the elite, the middle class, the striving middle class, and the poor people. And that's really the three protagonists, so to speak, in these different characters. Well, when you think about it, Cuba's long history has been one of thwarted reform, beginning with the Spanish occupation. Cuba was, as they call it, the key of the Antilles, because, if you'll recall, the Manila galleons that came from the Philippines bringing the goods to Spain would go across the Mexican over to Veracruz, and then on ships there, flotilla, and then the ones coming up from South America and Panama and so forth would come up with the gold and silver, etc. And from Potosi and Bolivia and other places, the gold and silver mines, etc. And they would all assemble in Veracruz because they were they were open to pirate attacks. And as we know, the famous buccaneers were sanctioned by Queen Elizabeth, and by the various monarchies that were competing for power in the Caribbean. So that was constantly. So after a while, they decided the only way to do it was in convoys that would be protected, so they would make it across the Atlantic. And you know, the way the Gulf Stream works, and this is how the Canary Islands became the main staging area on the way to the New World, because of the currents rotate like this around the Atlantic. So it comes down from, say, the Azores, comes down off the coast of the Canaries, and sweeps down into the Caribbean, exactly where Columbus landed in one of the Bahamas Islands, and then goes up the Gulf of Mexico and offshore the coast of Florida and the Atlantic, and takes you, that same current will take you to the Azores and then to the Iberian Peninsula. So they utilize the prevailing winds and the currents to do that. This is all by way of saying that Cuba was a strategic country, and that's why it was one of the last colonies. As you know, most of the Latin American former colonies gained their independence in 1812, 1821, the famous Simon Bolivar, O'Higgins in Chile, you know, all those famous liberators were the revolutions of 1812. Why? Because in Spain they had a revolution going on. The Cortes, which was their parliament, at one point basically took power from the monarchy, and there was always this constant wrestling between the monarchy and the parliamentary, and you know, so during that time of weakness, the Latin American colonies decided to strike, following the example of the French Revolution, of course, the American Revolution. And as you know, some of the American, Latin American patriots participated in the American Revolution as well. So there's a whole story behind that, including Cuban revolutionaries. And even in the Civil War in the United States, one of the most famous spies, I believe for the North, for the Union, was a Cuban woman. And her story, there's a separate, I cannot remember her name now, but if you do a little searching, you'll come across her biography. It's fascinating. But anyway, so how did the middle class fail in their attempt to change Cuba? I would say it was primarily the United States, because there were two wars of liberation. The first one failed. The second one, which was the final one, the Cubans were very close to achieving their goals. And at that point, people like Hearst and Pulitzer, who were competing with each other in their yellow press, decided to take up the cause of anti-Spain into their newspaper, their yellow press, and began to denigrate Spain and fabricate stories about brutality. Now, they were fighting a civil war in Cuba, but it wasn't the exaggeration. You know, the Hearst press was saying that women were raped and abused. None of this really happened. What did happen is the Spanish governor, the military governor, to prevent the rebels from gaining material support from the population, herded parts of the population into what we might call camps. Some people call it concentration camps, but people weren't starving and dying in these. This is not the Nazis. So the Hearst and the Yellow Press took that and blew it up into something it never was, got the Americans all worked up. This is the time of the white man's burden, Teddy Roosevelt, you know, and the Rough Riders, and off they rode to liberate Cuba when they were on the verge of winning their liberation from a weakened Spanish Empire. And this is something Cuba never forgot nor forgave the United States for doing. Because not only, and she talks about it in the novel, some of the great leaders of the Cuban Revolution, when the Spanish were defeated, and it was not a hard thing, when they took possession of some of the key cities, the Americans did not allow the Cuban generals and troops to march in to take possession along with the Americans. So, you know, we're really good at making enemies with sometimes the best intentions. So that begins then. The second part, and then I'll wrap it up, is the U.S. forced the Cuban government well, first of all, there was a military occupation for about 2 decades. And it ran as an American garrison. Now, the U.S. did do good things. They helped with public health, cleaning up, bringing certain industries, mechanized, you know, a lot of good things. But on a political side, it was ruinous to Cuba, because this is where the corruption began, where Cuban politicians got in bed with American businessmen, and this persisted for the next, 60 years. So finally, when the United States withdraws from Cuba, unlike Puerto Rico, which becomes a permanent colony we now call a Commonwealth, the Cubans had to sign the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment gave the U.S. the right to intervene whenever it felt like in Cuban affairs. Plus, it gave the famous base, you know the one I'm talking about,
Guantanamo.
Guantanamo, in perpetuity to the United States. And it still is there. So that's where the story begins, and that's why revolutionary movements like the 1941 to fight the corruption in the regime ultimately failed because the U.S. supported whoever could take charge of the country to make Cuba great for American business interests. Now, one thing that people misinterpret about Cuba is they try to make it into complete colony satrapy of the United States, that everything was owned by American companies. That is not true. At the time that the revolution of '59 takes power in Cuba, Cuba was, I think, number 3 in the hemisphere in what do you call it, in GDP and in life, health, and they were right there after the United States and Canada. And pretty self-sufficient. Cuba exported rice, they exported beef, they raised cattle. But things like the electric company were owned by the Americans. There were American refineries. What's the big sugar? Hershey had big refineries in Cuba. But there were a lot of very wealthy Cubans as well. And those were the first wave that went to Miami. Those were the guys who already had the connections with America, who spoke English. Their children trained and educated in Europe or in the United States. That was the first wave of Cubans. The Mariel group that came much later were the ones that were promised prosperity by the revolution, and they quickly realized that that wasn't happening, and they were willing to risk their lives to leave any way they could. So I don't know if that really gave you a very long-rounded...
Yes, it definitely helped me. I guess your tour is going to continue in Miami.
I don't have plans right now, maybe after COVID is over, but yeah, there's a wonderful bookstore in Coral Gables, and I need to get in touch with them to see if they would like to. I'll tell you one problem, and I'll conclude here because, yeah, I'm 5 minutes over the allocated promised time. But publishing one of these books, I don't know if any of you have ever done a book, but as Sue will tell you, this is not the day of the old days like Hemingway or any of those guys, where if you were lucky and your manuscript reached the desk of an editor from one of the publishing houses, they would take you by the hand if you showed promise and be your godfather for your career. Them days are gone. Publishing, as we all know, has now become a mega industry. Publishing houses have been absorbed by big corporations. Bookstores have been absorbed by big corporations. The indies are surviving, thank goodness. But when you try to publish a book nowadays, you need to find an agent. Well, to get an agent to look at your manuscript, you might as well run for political office. No, seriously, I admire anybody who gets published by any well-known, reputable commercial publisher, because it's like being a prize fighter. Only 1 out of 10,000 make it to the top. And that's one aspect. So you need to find, first of all, an agent, because publishers will not accept unsolicited manuscripts. Rule number 2. So you get the agent who wants to do you. He or she will then look for a publisher that fits your style, and then has to sell it to them, and then the publisher may or may not take. This can take years. Now, I made all the mistakes a beginner would make by submitting the unedited manuscript that I had from 1969, before Sue got a hold of it, to one of the agents for a well-known author by the name of Oscar Ijuelos. And he was kind enough to give me his agent's name. I sent the damn thing in a box to him. He read it over a weekend and very politely sent it back with a note saying, lovely book, but I don't do that kind of editing which it needs. Good luck. And so I kind of burned my bridges before I even got to the bridge. And at that point, I said, okay, what I need to do is get somebody who knows how to edit a book. And as it turns out, which I didn't know at the time, Sue had been Lorna's last, although for a brief time, editor.
Yeah.
And you act, well, maybe you could say a couple of things about it, Sue, if you don't mind.
No, that's all right.
No, please
I'm
do.
listening
I don't want to put you on the spot, but,
No, you just continue.
okay, all right. At any rate, so apparently the novel that Sue was working on was a little different than the one you have here today. And in fact, when I wanted to publish this or send it on, my mother had said, oh no, I've done more work on it, forget that one. So I don't want to downplay this, but this is the only complete MS that I have of the book that stands on its own merits, I would think. And Sue did a yeoman's job of doing up a lot of cleaning. There were some idiosyncrasies in chronology that she fixed.
And we had a lot of back and forth.
We had lots of back and forth. And then finally, when I got there and I looked again for publishers, I quickly realized, you know, I don't have another 10 years to do this. I want to get this out. It was something I promised to do. So I went in Bethesda, we have a writer's center, and I was lucky enough to get the manager, a young lady who's very gifted, to take it on, and she designed the cover with our back and forth, and she put it into a format, and she said, you know, if I were you, I have a lot of people who self-publish, and they do it through Amazon. I went, you know, a lot of indies don't like Amazon, a lot of people don't like it for other reasons. But I said, the good thing about it is it doesn't cost me anything, and it's very inexpensive, as you know. If you go on the site, you'll see I made sure that the price is low enough. I'm not looking to even recoup my investment. I just want to get it out. And but the downside is I went to Moe's, for example, which was one of Lorna's hangouts and one of mine all the years. And I talked to, I think it was Moe's wife, and she said, or was it daughter?
Yeah.
Was very nice and very polite, and she said, we don't take self-published books. And she gave me a whole long reason for it. I said, no, I understand. That's the problem. A lot of booksellers, and it has to do with the way bookselling works, because bookstores will not take a book that they cannot return to the publisher. So in essence, it's on consignment. And this is print on demand. So if I send 50 copies to Moe's and they only sell 5, I'm stuck with the remainder. And I can either tell Moe, we'll give them away, or send them to the compost, or I pay to have them shipped back to me. And the other thing is the price structure. Production cost is pretty low. It's almost less than half of what you pay retail. And the other part is a percentage of profit that they keep on top of production, and then the remainder goes to me as what do you call it? The
Residual.
yeah. There was, what's the other word that they use in publishing?
Royalties.
Yeah. What did you say?
Royalties.
Royalty. Thank you. So that's the problem, and in fact, the woman who's the president of the Berkeley Writers Club advised me not to do that, and I said, well, I'm sorry, but I don't have 10 years to do this, and so that's why it's here, and I am so lucky to have the Orly Museum of Hungarian Culture to be my inaugural presentation. If you go outside and look down to the left, you will actually look into Lorna's apartment. It's that flat roof, the corner. You can see into the corridor that went to her bedroom. So this is kind of like a kumbaya moment for Lorna and for me. And so, anyway, thank you very much.